Hello everyone, John Fenn here with supernaturalhousechurch.org. Once again talking about the discipleship process and once again bringing you kind of a behind the scenes or heaven's perspective on things. And today I want to share with you some of the things the Lord told my handicapped son about his future and something the Lord's going to do with him in his future. And also what the Lord told me during a visitation, during the hardest decision my wife and I have ever made, and that is when we put our son into a group home after living at home the first 24 years of his life. A little bit of background for you. We've got three boys, the oldest of which is Chris, who was born with the umbilical cord around his neck in a slip knot. And so Barb went through an emergency C-section, and they pulled Chris out, and the cord was around in a slip knot, and brain damage was done. And even though Chris just celebrated his 37th birthday, as I'm speaking this, he is 4 years old mentally. He's the oldest of our three boys. Our other boys are married and children and the normal life and everything. But when Chris was 6 months old, we'd newly moved to Boulder, Colorado area, just settling in, getting the family doctor and all that. And Chris was not sitting up normally. And Barb took him to the doctor, and the doctor told her this: your son has cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy is not a disease. It's a general term for any brain injury sustained during labor or delivery. That's what cerebral palsy, or CP, is. He said he's got cerebral palsy. Put him in a home and forget you ever had this child. Go on and live your lives and forget you ever had this child. Go on, have lots more babies and live your life. Of course, Barb and I were devastated. Barb right there just into a pool of tears, and we were devastated, and we rejected that, and we decided we're going to raise Chris at home as a normal part of the family. And our other two boys, Jason and Brian, suffered embarrassment at restaurants and different things like that. As Chris was growing up, but he's just part of the family. And for the first 24 years, he was at home normally. But I've got to tell you, he did not develop normally. In that when he was three, he did not say a word until he was 3.5 years old. He would get around, if you think of this ballpoint pen here rolling on the floor, that's how Chris got around. He was as stiff as a log almost at times as far as how he got around. He could just roll from side to side. That's how he got around. We had a little scooter where we'd put him with his chest down on this little scooter, kind of like a mechanic's creeper, with little four wheels, and he would go like this with his hands and pull himself along the kitchen floor and any place where there was a hard floor. And finally, one night, Barb couldn't take it anymore. He's 3.5 years old. He's practically outgrowing a crib. And she was pouring out her heart and just crying out to the Lord. And she said, you've got to do something, Father. You've got to do something. We're in ministry. We've got family, all these different things. Chris had never spoken. He'd never sat up. He was just a log on the floor that would roll to get from place to place. And suddenly she heard at the end of that prayer, she just was pouring out her heart. And she heard, Mommy, Mommy, Mama. And she ran upstairs, and Chris was sitting up in his crib and for the first time talking. So the Lord did a little bit of a miracle right there, and I'm telling you, he hasn't stopped talking since. He's the friendliest kid friendliest 4-year-old in now a 37-year-old body. All the clerks around town know him. All the restaurant wait staff knows him, and everything like that. But for the first 24 years, Chris was at home, and Chris had some amazing experiences. The Lord had started appearing to me in April of '86, and different times throughout a year. We've had times where, it's like the Lord, I'm in the Spirit, Barb and I are in the Spirit in our living room, and the Lord's right there, and Chris and the boys are asleep in the bedroom, and it's like, just go over and touch my son. But you've got to understand, when I was in ministry and traveling and at home, Chris is my size. He's, as an adult, 180 pounds. And my 5'3" wife couldn't lift him to the toilet and everything. And so Chris was in an adult diaper. When I'd go off in ministry, or when I'd go to work, when I was on staff at a big church and I'd go off in the morning, Chris is in an adult diaper. So he'd have to do all his business there in the diaper. Very hard on him. Even he has his self-awareness and everything. And you can imagine a teenage boy and then later a man. Like I said, he was at home for the first 24 years of his life. And I'd talk to him. I'd say, Chris, I need to go tell people about Jesus. And he'd go, okay, you go, Jad, tell people about Jesus. And he and Barb would endure that time, where he'd try to get the top part of his body into bed, and Barb lift his legs to get in there at night. But he'd do his business in an adult diaper, and they endured that. But one day, Chris comes crawling down. He's 22 years old. He comes crawling down the hallway, and he kind of army man style, army man style. He can support his weight. I get behind him and under his armpits and transfer him to the toilet and to the bed and kind of walk him a little bit, pick him up off the floor. I'm big. I can pick up 180 pounds, off the floor. If he wants to play on the floor with his cars and stuff. But he comes crawling down the hallway one morning. He goes, Dad, know what Jesus said to me? Know what Jesus said? I said, no, Chris, what did he say? Jesus said he's going to walk through the mountains with me. Yep, that's what he said, all right. Isn't that great? Jesus is going to walk through the mountains with me. Yep, that's what he said to me. He's going to walk through the mountains with me. And ever since that day, Chris has had that in his heart. Jesus is going to walk through the mountains with him. And, you know, for me as a dad, I'd like to say, by his stripes you were healed. That's going to happen now. But in Chris's mind, inability to really understand time and space and everything like that, I remember one time looking at some kids running on TV on Sesame Street opening or something like that. And he said, when I get to heaven, I'm going to run like that. No wheelchair in heaven. And he just talked about it, and he's very good. He's, you know, we were sitting there one time in front of the train tracks, watching a train go by, and he goes, yep, you know, the Lord just loves trains. And he's done that with trash trucks and everything. The Lord just loves trains. The Lord loves trash trucks. And the Lord is so good to him and gracious to him to order our steps and to arrange so that we see trains and trash trucks and fire engines and stuff like that. And Chris was at home for the first 24 years of his life. But the more I traveled and in ministry and everything, and like I said, he was in an adult diaper, and brain injury people don't like change. They don't like sudden noises. They are, you know, stuff like that. And so it was very hard. And finally got to the point, it's like Barb saying, you can't be gone for 6 days. You know, he's in an adult diaper. It's so hard on us. And, you know, and Chris would get angry and it's like, go get Dad, you know, and he'd poop in his diaper and all that. And then it got down to, okay, you can only go on weekends, you know, out on Friday, back Sunday night type of thing. And Jason and Brian went off to school after graduating high school and went off to college and then eventual marriage and all that. And it became clear we couldn't just keep going and also take care of Chris. It was one or the other, full-time caregivers or put a roof over our head. And we searched around, we found a group home that was founded by a Christian couple for their daughter some years ago. And that, by the time you throw in a bathroom break or fill up the car, it's a 2-hour drive from our house. How do you tell a 4-year-old he can't live at home anymore? How do you tell a mental 4-year-old after he's been at home for 24 years, son, you have to move 2 hours away? The way we put it was Jason and Brian went to school, so Chris has to go to school. Jason and Brian don't live here anymore because they went to school, now it's Chris go to school. But it was the hardest decision of our life. And when we finally found the place, and they said, well, it could be a couple months, you know, before we have an opening. And we thought, great, at least we got a couple months to adjust and get our thinking. They called like 4 days later and said, we have an opening. We've arranged things where we can handle him in a wheelchair and different things. And I said, well, we need another week or so. And that night, this is the 13th anniversary of the week that we placed him in a group home as I'm recording this. And on, I believe it was Friday night or Saturday night, January 3rd or 4th. Of 03 or 04, I guess, and Barb and I were just kind of crying ourselves to sleep. And we were saying this, if we live another 50 years on this earth, we would rather Chris go home and be in heaven. I've been to heaven. Barb has seen glimpses of heaven and visions here and there of things, but I've been a couple times and great Lord graciously gave me a tour and different stuff like that. So, you know, my thinking was, you know, if we miss 50 years of our lives, missing our son because he's in heaven, you know, and the risk of forgetting his face, forgetting his sense of humor, forgetting the blessing that he was to us. We would rather do that. And so Barb kind of drifted off to sleep, and I was just finished saying, I said, Father, if you're not going to heal my son, then take him home. And we will go through life missing our son, but at least he'll be in heaven. He'll be free from his damaged body. I had no sooner, and this was a silent prayer, I'm just praying this quietly because Barb has rolled over next to me and kind of cried herself to sleep and was asleep and everything. And suddenly the Lord Jesus was standing there in the room, 11 o'clock at night or so. And without an introduction or anything else, he just looked at me and he said, would you have Chris miss out on the fullness of his reward by me bringing him home early, just because you feel bad for having to place him in a group home? And I was taken aback, and I said, oh, Lord, I said, I'm sorry. I know that when I go, I know that Barb and I are one, and she shares in anything, you know, ministry-wise as far as your accounting goes. And I know that I asked Chris for permission to go tell people about Jesus, but I never, you know, mentally I knew that, but I'm sorry, I never thought of it as Chris having a reward and the fullness of his reward. So, Lord, I don't want Chris to miss out on the fullness of his reward just because we feel bad for having to put him in a group home. I said, but two conditions. He went, okay. And I said, number one, that he not suffer abuse, and number two, that he not suffer neglect. And with a nod of his head, he went, done, like that. He just went, done, boom, and then he was gone. So my point here in this morning is sharing this on our 13th anniversary of placing him in a group home. And I can tell you that after about 4 or 5 years, he was not doing good. Again, how do you tell a mental 4-year-old that you can't live at home? You got to live 2 hours away. With our ministry travels, we were only seeing him once every 6 weeks or so. And so we moved closer to him because he wasn't doing well. We now live about 30 minutes away, and he's home every Friday. And Friday is Chris' day, and he spends the night here at home. And then Saturday evening, I take him back to the group home and everything. And he's, he looks forward to these days, where he calls the shots. He can tell me what he wants to eat and tell mom, what he'd like to eat and all that. But my point is this: in Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 19, the writer is talking about the hope that is set before us. And he said, the hope that we have enters into that which is beyond the veil. That is, the hope which we have enters beyond the veil. That is, into heaven. You see, Chris has a hope. Jesus told him, I'm going to walk through the mountains with you. Now, to him, it doesn't matter whether it's in this life or the next age. It doesn't matter. He knows Jesus is going to walk through the mountains with him. And I know that he will fulfill the fullness of his days and the fullness of his reward. I've seen with my own eyes, I've been told by the aides, that Chris grabs his little friend who's a Christian, and they're just bound by the Spirit in the Lord. They don't mentally, she doesn't say much, but she can walk, and Chris can't walk, but he talks nonstop. And they will say this, that when Frankie, his little friend, when she falls or something like that, Chris will grab her hand and say, it's okay, Frankie, Jesus is with us. And when she's not feeling good, he grabs her hand and has a moment of silence, and he goes, amen. And only the Lord knows what he's praying. But he's a blessing to there, even at that group home, as much as he is also difficult sometimes to deal with. But I want to leave you with that hope, that Chris lives in the hope. By how much I would love to see him healed. He knows one day Jesus is going to walk in the mountains with him. And each of us have a hope within us of certain promises and certain things for the next age. And Hebrews 6:19 says that hope enters into that which is beyond the veil, within the veil. So hold on to that hope. Hold on to that confident expectation. And keep your eyes on the big picture, because we're already in eternity. And we need to look at things just like my mental 4-year-old son does. Have that big picture look. God bless. We'll talk to you later.